The next individual, I tried to get bios from all these people and you know, did fairly well, but there was a translation error in the Canadian side, so I had a hard time getting a bio, but it really didn't matter. Greg Tegart is our next speaker, and Greg is the Regional Manager for Central British Columbia Operations in the Ministry of Agriculture and Lands. And I couldn't do any more than tell you that I've worked with Greg in the Society for Range Management and as professionals and advocates for rangelands. There is no one that I have ever worked with that I hold in higher regard than Greg Tegart. He absolutely brings things to the conversation that you cannot believe. And I don't usually tell him that because he usually was always wanting me to buy him beer, but he is a great guy and a very thoughtful person, and I feel fortunate to count him as one of my good friends. Greg Tegart, please.
Well, thank you, Bob, and I guess I should switch away from my comment about which one of us has the accent, since you're so kind to me, right? But
that's right.
I've grown accustomed to the fact that I must be the one that has the accent. I haven't checked that out. Do I have the accent, or do you people have the accent? I used to think that if I said it first, it meant you had it, but I don't think that works when the audience is this strong. I just wanted to set a little context for those of you who may, or am I close enough? I like to wander, so podiums are intimidating. Context, so that you can maybe understand a little bit better how, other than just being on the other side of the border, our political system fits. In Canada, we don't have much of a federal presence in the management of our land and water resources. And although some people may applaud that, other people may not. But in general, the provinces are accountable and responsible for the public lands. We call them crown lands. Remember, we have a queen, she has a crown. And so they're her lands by the way we evolved, particularly in British Columbia. So in British Columbia, we have an awful lot of crown or public lands. And we have 95 million hectares, which is somewhere around 240 million acres of land in British Columbia, 93% of which is owned by the Crown or managed by the Crown, and that management is done by the province of British Columbia. 1% has the influence of the federal government directly upon it, and that includes things like national parks and First Nations lands and a few other particularly special areas. And 6% belongs to people like you and I if we can afford to buy it. We may own some of it in private holdings. The vast majority of those private holdings and the population is kind of unique in the Fraser River Valley, or the Delta, which is next to the city of Vancouver. That's where the vast majority of our population lives, and then the rest of us enjoy the other 91 million hectares of what the province has to offer. And that's not true of the other provinces. There's differing levels of privatization. Alberta, for example, has a far much higher percentage of private lands than British Columbia does. So that's enough background setting. I was asked to provide you what I thought was the three most issues facing natural resource management in the province, and then make some comment on how I thought professional societies or organizations like this could be of assistance to us in that regard. Well, Bob knows I couldn't keep it to three, but I cut it to five, I think, Bob. So first, I think that I'm going to use the word healthy, and I don't want anybody to get annoyed with me for picking that word, but I did it deliberately because I think having healthy rangelands is one of the things that's going to be our ongoing challenge. And I say that not in the context of any science, but I say that in the context of healthy as it's defined by a very broad audience of opinions and perspectives on the subject. Because the public in British Columbia is very interested in our crown lands and how they're managed and what opportunities and values they provide them. So it's a wider audience, and so the word healthy can handle that because it's not too concise. Things like how it's managed, how the species are changing. We heard a lot from Gail. Thank you, Gail. I don't have to go into climate change now. That's great. So climate change is an issue for us, and you know, everybody associates climate change in a different manner. In BC, one of the things that just hit us is something called a mountain pine beetle, this little critter that's managed to change the look of our landscapes from green to red and then this grayish black thing, change the the local hydrologic functions change a lot of species and opportunities, and provide us with a very interesting challenge, both socially, economically, and ecologically. That's a critter that isn't an invasive species. It's been around for quite a while in British Columbia and probably in other areas, but it really took off. And one of the primary factors is I guess the suspicion is the warming trend. So we didn't have cold enough winters, and that critter was able to multiply. So we can have invasive species, and we can have some native species that might surprise us in how resilient or how adaptive they are to changing environments. We also have a very good program of fire suppression, though some years like 2003 it didn't appear that way on the news, nor to those of us that live close to them. But we have been very good at suppressing fire, and one of the other challenges is to regain some of the habitats and features that were lost in those areas where grasslands transitioned into the timber zones, and we should have more open forests. So there's some challenges in that venue. We also have maybe what might be a unique one, and we call it First Nations. You people know them as Native American Indians. Joel, if he's in the audience, I think it's very similar to that Australia thing you're talking about at lunch, Joel. We didn't have treaties with some of those First Nations people, and we just marched ahead in our colonial style. And now those people are claiming rights. So they're not just claiming rights on their Indian reservations. They're claiming rights of occupancy, rights of management, territorial rights, areas of interest throughout the province. So the word consultation in British Columbia means you have some legislative changes you need to consult with the First Nations community. So that becomes a very daunting challenge for the bureaucracy to move ahead. It's slow enough as it is without having another layer to contend with. And I'm actually checking my notes, Bob. Adjusting to the different types of uses that are hitting our landscape. You know, we had lots of space in British Columbia by the eyes of many, we still do. But we have different uses. We have recreation uses. We have expectations around water and water quality. We have corridors. We have all sorts of corridors. And I talked to my colleagues from Alberta, and I'm going to use them as a bit of an example, and they share this. We share it with them in the Peace River in the north part of British Columbia, and they share it throughout their province, and that's it. There are all sorts of corridors. By that I mean transmission lines, access lines, roads, exploration routes. And you know, in Alberta you might characterize it in the north and in the north piece of BC. Anywhere that you want to go explore to see if you can drill a hole down and make some energy-related money, you've got all sorts of those routes. And all that dramatically changes the shape and texture of that environment from a management perspective and also from a species and species exposure perspective. Then one of probably the more interesting challenges from my personal perspective as a manager is the human resource challenge. We're at the tail end of that baby boomer bubble that I lived all my life in, and now we're finding it very hard to recruit more Gregs, and that's to the great glee of some of my supervisors. But that aside, that we still are having trouble retaining, and we're looking forward to being competitive in a marketplace that has lots of opportunity for young people, and usually better salaries outside of government than inside of government. So we have to find ways to have an opportunity that these people really enjoy and want to participate in, so that we can benefit from their insights and knowledge and continue to provide the services to BC we're expected to. And I did mention water, and I don't want to de-emphasize water, but water allocation, as Gail alluded to, its time and timing on the landscape, it could well change. But we have a lot of water sources in BC that provide drinking water. They're upland water sources. They're not in deep lakes or aquifers. And where you have livestock or where you have logging activities that transition through those zones, there's a fair amount of differences of opinions on what's compatible and what isn't. And we also have, of course, the great fish debates that is quite common on the West Coast. And in places like Alberta, water allocation is also interesting in that it's for irrigation as it is in BC. It's also for human consumption, but they also have some industrial uses like pumping it down wells and stuff like that that have some interesting impacts and discussions around their situations with water as well. I want to switch a little bit now, if I might, to what societies might be able to do or provide us in the way of partnership and collaboration. And first and foremost, I mean, I cherish these types of venues. I even cherish my friendship with Bob Budd and everybody else in this room. I think that's one of the things that professional societies and other societies can do for us, is provide those opportunities for us to share, learn, and learn how to communicate with people that come from different backgrounds, have different opportunities and different insights, and do it in a manner that's hopefully courteous, but always in a learning vein. And the one thing that I'm very, very sure of is that as smart as Bob Budd is, the collective intelligence in this room will kill him every time, even with my help. And so in terms of learning the technical disciplines, I think that's, and how to translate that, and how to understand it, and how to apply it, and how to use it in all the avenues that you and I all do day to day. The other part is how to learn how to bring that information together from those varying sources and come up with better options and better activities or better results for us to take forward and work in. And those of you who are somewhat students of different systems of thinking and stuff like that, you might recognize that I'm basically talking about the concepts of learning organizations like Peter Senge and others are subscribing to these days, or have been for a decade and a half now. And I think the other thing that I've really benefited from, and it's because I get to come across that 49th parallel, I shed my political biases, I shed all the policy things, and I have to learn new acronyms when I'm down here, because you folks are talking, you know, with acronyms and words that I don't understand. And so for me to learn how to communicate in that venue, I have to go back to the basics. I have to say, what are the principles you're talking about? What are you attempting to do? What are your objectives? To gain some understanding of what your policies and how you're going to evolve from those thoughts are. And I've benefited from that because of the people's patience that I've talked with, and I think societies can do that. They can keep we bureaucratic folks that have a political agenda or a social agenda or whatever agenda, we can bring us back down to that honest plane of the technical use and the use of the people and the information we have. And with that, I'm just very thankful to be invited and provide you with a different accent.
Thanks to Greg, and every time that we get together, it seems like I always have to remind him that he talks about our acronyms and our agency names and everything, and those of you who don't know how Canada got its name, they argued mightily over what the country's name would be, and finally they said they'll throw the letters of the alphabet in a hat and draw them out, and they did, and they went C-A-N-A-D-A. So there it is. For those of you who are having a hard time spelling, I'll draw it out later.